Hello, my name is Morgan Janovic, and I am a moderator of today's Pink Talk. On behalf of Young Educators European Association, it is my great honor to welcome our guest, Daisy Khan. She's one of the most prominent Muslim women leaders in the United States. She's the executive director of the Women's Islamic Initiative, inspiring Muslim women around the globe and creating a peaceful and equitable global environment by building bridges of understanding between faiths. Her memoir, Born with Wings, a spiritual journey of a modern Muslim woman, was listed as top 10 spiritual books to read by Booklist. She's the executive editor of Wise Up, Knowledge and Extremism, a toolkit that speaks out against all forms of hate, including terrorism and Islamophobia. Her first of its kind book, 30 Rights of Muslim Women, is one-stop educational resource that utilizes Islamic legal framework to uphold a comprehensive suite of women's rights. I strongly recommend Daisy's upcoming publication, Wise Up, White Supremacy, aimed at re-educating the public on the subject of white supremacy and its inflammatory rhetoric targeted at Muslims and other minorities. She has received over 20 awards, including the Eleanor Roosevelt Award for Human Rights, for her courageous actions, and has been included in Time magazine's 100 Most Influential People, among others. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation. It is the absolute honor for me and for us to host this discussion today. And before I start, I would like to underline that we are here to deepen the knowledge and confront commonly heard patterns. The widespread polarization has a huge impact on the way we relate to what we don't know and what we are afraid of. Thank you very much. And with that, we come to the main part of the meeting, which are our questions. And let's jump in straight to the point. Let's talk about feminism. Islam is often portrayed as religion in which women are submissive to men and have limited freedom. We often hear about the homogeneous image that is required of women, namely complete obedience and devotion. The Western concept of feminism is often seen as contradictory to what we hear about religion of Islam. Can we say that feminism is contained in Islam?
Well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me. And I am excited to engage with this global audience of young people. I get very excited when I hear that young people want to increase their knowledge, because we are living in an age where information is confused for knowledge. Knowledge in Islam means ilm. Ilm means expanding one's horizon. So I'm very excited that your generation is taking this step, because without knowledge, there's a very beautiful statement of Al-Ghazali, who was a great philosopher, who said that knowledge without action is vanity, and action without knowledge is insanity. So if you really ponder on that and you think about that, and there is a lot of activism going on in the world right now and a lot of protests, but oftentimes people don't lack that knowledge, that knowledge which is deep, that actually can change hearts and minds and transform people. So I just wanted to tell you that I applaud you for doing this, and I'm super excited. And I hope that today we will be able to bring some deeper, insights into what you would like to know about. So feminism, whether it is coming from Islam or it's coming from the West, is simply a push to realize equality that Muslims believe is already promised in Islam. Contrary to what people think, the missing piece here is that Muslim women's rights, although embedded in Islam, are denied to many Muslim women. So in the 7th century, which is, for almost 1400 years ago, when our scripture was revealed to Prophet Muhammad, who lived in Arabia at the time, the society, women were very much, women had a lot of freedom, but at the same time, they were also exploited because they had vast freedoms. They were exploited. There were no marriage rules. They could be dispensed with. They could be inherited by the men in their families. And when Quran came down, it gave women specific rights that they didn't have. And first of all, the right to complete equality to men, meaning that men and women are equal because they have been created of the same substance. So substantively, the Quran says we created you from one substance. We created Adam and Eve, and then out of that, you grew and you became humans. And humans are also regarded as stewards of God. And humans, meaning all humankind, so God makes no distinction between men, women, or European and Muslims. It makes no distinction because God says, "I created all of you." So this equality of men and women as being equal agents of God on earth is embedded in the Quran, and there are a couple of verses that mention that. And I don't want to take up too much of your time, but this gave rise to women being equally involved in the religious affairs and the political affairs and the community affairs at a very early stage during the early days of the after 7th century, after the prophet passed on, because women were right next to the prophet. They were engaged in communities. So that gave rise to women being fully participating in societies. Now you might ask, what happened? It always happens, right? What happens? Women do a lot, but they often get written out of history books. And this is something that every woman of every faith complains about. Women have made tremendous roles in communities and have been side by side with the prophets, right? From the early days. There was not a prophet that was not supported by a woman next to him, whether it was Moses or whether it was Jesus or whether it was Prophet Muhammad or it was Abraham, there was always a woman there supporting, upholding, and being the backbone. So, but these stories get written out of history books, and as empires expanded and Muslim empires became more politicized, women got relegated out of the picture. So what we're doing right now, we Muslim women who believe in feminism, who don't necessarily call it feminism by its name, but it's Quranic feminism. We are going deep into our scriptures and finding all kinds of treasures there, not only treasures from our scripture, but also women who have played significant roles. And we're trying to re-educate the people, just like you are doing right now. So Islamic feminism is very much embedded in the Quran.
Thank you very much. That's a amazing response to our question. I have to say that because I was raised in Poland, in the Catholic country, I did not have a chance to know much about Islam itself. We should be taught more about different religions, to be more aware of what is really behind the Islam, not just to read or watch a TV and then intake this knowledge, which is not necessarily the truth. Then I have another question, because from my understanding, there are 4 verses in the Quran that are used as an argument for covering the body, which can be interpreted in many ways, as we all know. So I know that some claim that there are even 10 different interpretations, with none of them agreeing or even disagreeing with others.
Yeah.
There are 2 verses that addressed to women in general and 2 to prophets' wives. However, it requires a considerable stretch of the imagination to interpret those verses as meaning that women should be completely covered. So my question is it mandatory for women to cover her face and body in Islam, or is it a matter of choice?
Well, so it is definitely not mandatory for women to cover their face, because it is actually evidenced by the fact that during the Hajj, which is the annual pilgrimage, nobody covers their face. In fact, you are prohibited from covering your face. So that Muslims, and that is supposed to be the premier place where people come and worship. This is like considered to be God's place. So first of all, there is no, it's not mandatory for people to cover their face. But what is mandatory in the Quran is modesty, as it is with every other monotheistic faith, right? Modesty is the norm. It is not abnormal. It's actually abnormal not to be modest. It's modesty means you have to cover those parts of your body that elicit a sexual response. So what Muslim scholars did was they defined modesty in different cultures in different ways. So some was simply, if you had a culture which was more like, like in Arabia, people lived mostly in the deserts. And deserts, as you know, from all the Hollywood movies that you see, have a lot of sandstorms, right? So people naturally covered their faces. People naturally have, to this day, when the mask is being covered, everybody is covered. They used to cover their faces because they had to protect themselves from the sand. So that came from that. So it was a natural, normative way that people dressed. But when you go all the way to Egypt, where it was an agrarian culture, in agrarian cultures, people are farming. Women are farming. They're in the fields. They can't mess around with their hair too much. They need to show their legs because they have to go into the fields. And so you have a whole different sense of modesty there, right? So the rules of modesty differed from country to country, culture to culture, of what was considered a private part of a woman. But the private part of a woman, the Quran does not mention the hair. The Quran mentions the bosom. It says, take your veil, whatever you were wearing at that time, and cover your bosom. So the bosom is definitely considered a sexual part of a woman, and of course her genitals. So this is the requirement. Now, over time, the hijab has become adopted and associated with Islam as if it is a requirement, right? So, but modesty is what's required. And modesty differs from culture to culture, including in the West. For instance, in the West, I'm fairly modest the way I'm dressed up, right? But if I went to Afghanistan, I wouldn't dress up like this because I would probably get myself killed. So you have to observe modesty in terms of that particular culture, that particular locale, and definitely covering the face is not an Islamic requirement.
And I have to ask you about the case, for example, in France, where they tried to, or already they did introduce the hijab ban. What is your response to something like that?
Yeah, so the problem with these bans is that although it's not clear to me for what reason the ban is, because it kind of goes against the very ideal of a democratic society to ban anything, to ban any kind of expression, because we value freedom of expression so highly that when we ban something for a particular group of people, it feels like that particular group is being singled out. So the response is that that community gets entrenched even more within their own subculture. So it doesn't really kind of promote the kind of understanding that you want to promote. What would have been better is if the French wanted, which is what always happened in Islamic history, is when Islam went from one locale to another, it expanded all the way from Arabia into the Byzantium and Mesopotamia, Persia, Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia. It went into all these cultures, right? And it adopted a local dress, a local form of modesty. It didn't go against what was already there. It took what was there and re-adopted it or made it more beautiful. And this has not happened in the West. I don't know why the French, who are known for their fashion, why cannot they come up with a hijab that is very French and also allows the Muslims to express their modesty in the way that they want to express it? Why there's this disconnect, I don't understand. You have the Fendis, you have all these great people who create these great fashion, iconic, and they go all the way to Arabia and they make these beautiful clothes for women in Arab countries, but they don't do it in their own country. it would be better if the French came up with a solution that is very French, a French solution, and then it would become a fashion statement. And I'm not saying this because it hasn't been tested. It's been tested in the US. So in the US, we have a lot of young women who have been observing hijab. But then they said, we don't want to just do it that way. We want to do it so that it's classy, it's pretty, it's very American. And so they came up with their own modest line. And so they became entrepreneurs. And then they were so successful that more women, faith-based women who couldn't find any modest clothing anywhere, actually going and buying clothes from these people. So you had Jewish women, you had Christian women, and people always complain, people of my age group, we always complain that we have nothing to wear because it's very hard to find fashionable clothing that is also modest. So there is money to be made here, and you just have to be creative. And, I fundamentally think that when the government says ban something, it does not bode well. Now, the other solution would have been to have Muslim scholars read into this and come up with some sort of an opinion on this issue. And that would have been much better, because if the opinion is coming from within the community, then it is an internal matter, right? It's an internal matter that gets debated in the right way. But when you have a government banning something, all it does is creates a reverse reaction.
Absolutely, I agree. I actually had the moment last week when I was watching a fashion show with the Muslim dresses and everything. That was amazing. It was beautiful.
Yeah.
Those people, those designers, those ladies,
right.
They're just amazing. Their imagination is just wow.
It's amazing. I've seen beautiful stuff that I'm like, I don't wear hijab, but I would wear that because it's so beautiful.
Me too. Me too. I would definitely wear it.
And beauty is something, and this is why Muslims, when they went into different ancient cultures, they created the most magnificent headdresses that were, beautiful, colorful, that gave expression to that culture. It was embroidered, it was nice, had a piece of jewelry on it. And entire industries were created because of that. So we are lacking some imagination here. And because we're lacking imagination and we're not allowing people to imagine what's possible, you have kind of like a standard that has been adopted by people. So people then go and they adopt a standard, which then looks alien to that culture. And that's what the problem is.
That's well said. Absolutely, I agree with you. I know that there are few people who admitted this question to us. It's about child marriage in Islam.
Mm-hmm.
And well, I know only a little bit about it from the education back in Poland. But what I know is that according to Muslim law, marriage can take place once a person reaches the age of puberty.
Yeah.
Initially, this age for girls was set at 9 years old, but in 1916, it was set by the private council at 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
So under the Muslim law, a person under the age of 15 is considered a minor and has no capacity to consent to marriage unless a guardian gives consent. And the guardian, the person who can make this decision to marry, can only be the father or paternal grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
And this is from the perspective of many, this practice is unacceptable sometimes. And so my question to you is, why does Islam still allow child marriages?
Yeah, well, this is a very good question, actually. And this is a question that we have been struggling with for many years. Me, meaning Muslim women, have been struggling with. So the scholars, the four major schools of law determined that the age of puberty or maturity, as they defined it, is either 15 or 17 and 18, which is the Hanafi school, which is the largest school, by the way, said 18. Okay, so that's a huge number. So, and this was defined 1,000 years ago. So what you have is people refer to, so you have to have, the child cannot be a minor. They have to be a major, meaning major was usually defined by, strictly when you menstruate. right? You menstruate, you hit puberty, and that is what was considered. But in Islamic law, you have to enter a marriage contract by your own volition, right? Because you have to be a person who has to have the legal capacity to understand what they're consenting to, because you are making a lifelong contract, because a marriage is between two individuals. And so if you don't have the legal capacity to understand that what you are signing on to, then you are disqualified. And this is why the marriage age was considered to be, I guess in certain cultures, when you were 15, you were fairly mature. And when you were 17 or 18, then you were considered full maturity. So the reasons for child marriage are many. And unfortunately, oftentimes, parents will think that their daughter will have difficulty finding a husband if she's not a desirable childbearing age. So there's this confusion as to what is desirable childbearing age. And then, so that is one factor. The second factor is there is a lot of pressing economic factors where parents will offer this is where child marriage usually happen, is in conditions where there's a lot of poverty. And so they just want to get rid of their daughter, and they usually wed them to older men. And we see this happening in places like Afghanistan and Yemen and other places. And in some cases, girls are sold as property to pay a debt. In some cases, they are used as compensation for a crime an uncle or some distant relative committed. And so therefore, they will give their daughter in exchange to get rid of that, to pay as compensation. Sometimes they are trafficked and smuggled out of their countries to be a bride for an older wealthy man. All of these are completely un-Islamic. Okay, I must say once and for all, completely un-Islamic. Because Islam says there is no compulsion in the way of life, which means that no one can be coerced into anything. And if a girl is compelled into marriage, which most child marriages are, then that marriage is invalid. And so, a parent, the guardian that you mentioned, the role of the guardian was to safeguard you from being manipulated by the other side. Because, if it's a contract and the other contract is not favorable to you, then the older person in the family, usually your father or an uncle, somebody who was your guardian, would look out for you. But the guardian's role is not to coerce a young girl to be sold into marriage to another person. That also is wrong. And by the way, there's no mention of guardianship in the Quran. It's just something that developed over time, and it's a very cultural thing. So some people state the Prophet's marriage as a justification. And here is something that I would like to let you folks know, because oftentimes people say that he married a 9-year-old, and her age has been highly contested, because there is a lot of evidence that she was actually 16 or 17 years of age. She was married to the Prophet in 622. And there is historical records that she was involved in both battles in 624 and 625. And there was a minimum age requirement of 15 for both of these battles. So the youngest she would have been is 13 when she married the Prophet, not 9. And the reasons the permission was granted to the Prophet vis-a-vis his marriages was very unique to his prophethood and was no way to be emulated by Muslims. So a lot of Muslims say, well, we do what the Prophet did. So here's what I tell them. If you really want to do what the Prophet did, the Prophet married many women because he was given permission to marry many women by God. And partly 10 out of 11 women were widows of war. And they were either equal in age to him, like in their 50s, or a few were even older than him. So they were either widows, and he was trying to protect them, because when in those days in 7th century, if your husband died, you had no protection because the protector of your tribe was gone. So he provided sanctuary for these women because these men had fought alongside with him. So these marriages are very different and unique to him, not to be emulated. So if Muslims have to emulate the Prophet, then they should emulate the Prophet by marrying widows and women who are divorced, and women who have, no means of support. Not a 9-year-old, because we already mentioned that Aisha was not 9, and child marriage is in my opinion, and the opinion that I have, brought together from the research that we've done, that it is not justified at all.
What I understood is that the polygamy was allowed us during the numerous wars during the Prophet's time, and what I read together with my friends after the Battle of Uhud in Arabia, many
Right.
Muslims men lost their lives, and therefore women outnumbered the men, and therefore to protect those women, because back then women had no really protection and ability to function on their own.
Yeah.
Polygamy was introduced as a solution for this matter.
Yeah. Exactly. You are absolutely right. You just mentioned it. So polygamy was made permissible as a whole of society solution in a post-war scenario. It was mostly for the welfare of widows and orphans, because a lot of widows had children, right? And their children inherited whatever the husband left behind. So what people would do is they would just jump on these orphans. They would try to take the orphans and own them and then exploit their property. So this was why the permission came that, hey, men, those of you who are here, if you want, you can take these women along with their orphans and marry them and give them sanctuary, rather than, so this was meant to be a particular case. So, and it was conditional upon providing justice and fairness to all the wives, who must be treated equally, provided equal financial support, equal recreation, equal protection and comfort. So they but how they meant that it was only for men who either had enough wealth to be able to share it, distribute it evenly amongst all the wives, a man who was of very good character, who could be fair to all the wives and take care of them and not treat one over the other. And and the Quran instructs men that remaining monogamous is preferable, because it also says that you will not be able to create equality and justice amongst your wives. And unfair treatment can break up the family unit, damage the emotional well-being of mothers and children, and undermine the protection of family, which it was intended for. So, so therefore, majority of Muslims who do not engage in polygamy is because they know that they cannot, treat more than one wife fairly. The purpose of polygamy no longer exists. Actually, it does exist in places like Syria, where there are so many widows, but how many Muslims do you see running to Syria and taking a second wife to help them? Nobody, right? And and institutions for orphans now exist. People who are orphaned are put into institutions, and widows can now remarry or live self-sufficiently. So this practice is completely outdated. And this is why majority of Muslim countries discourage it and have laws that prohibit it. So, but unfortunately, because the Quran mentions it, in the context of this, many Muslims will take the middle part of the verse, says, take 1, 2, 3, or 4. And that's the part that they focus on because it's advantageous to them, because they want to have multiple wives, because they want to have the freedom to have, sexual relations with multiple wives within the institution of marriage. So, but also it's another important point to note that a woman can never be forced into entering a polygamous marriage. She has to give her explicit consent, and she has the right to also add a condition in her marriage contract that bars her husband from marrying another woman.
Okay, that's a very interesting part. I think it's definitely worth remembering. Mm-hmm. And next time when someone is going to try to say something ridiculous, then try to, say something back. Mm-hmm. I would like to go back for a bit to child marriages. I was wondering, you as a Muslim leader living in the United States, What do you do about child marriages inside of the United States?
Well, believe it or not, there are more than 10 states in the United States where there are no marriage age for child marriage. So we have child marriages in the U.S. And so there are several people, but United States is not just a federal system, it's a statewide system. So different states have different rules pertaining to marriage. So you have to fight state by state. So there are certain states where there were no marriage age laws. For instance, in New York, there was no marriage age. And, when you had when certain cases came up where, let's say, a young woman who's 12 years old or 14 years old, in the context of America, that's fairly young, right, is taken home to her home country, either in Africa or Pakistan or Bangladesh, anywhere, by her parents, because her parents are afraid that the daughter is going to get sexually active. So they try to rush her marriage, try to arrange a marriage very quickly now, and bring her back. And these cases began to come up, and more people began to think that maybe we should legislate laws. So there are several states where laws are now being put into place where there is a certain age limit where that you cannot marry beyond that age or under that age. So I don't particularly work on that myself, but I know people that are working on those kinds of things. In fact, I mean, I had a young woman who came to me who was about, she was 20 something, and she was my intern, and she had run away from home because her parents tried to force her into marriage since she was 12 years old, for the reasons I just mentioned, because they were afraid that she would become independent and active. And, many immigrant parents fear that their daughters are going to get, too westernized and seek their own independence. And so they tried to force her, and eventually she ran away from home because she wanted to study. And she got a MacArthur scholarship, which is a very prestigious scholarship. She's now on her way to a career path. But she mentioned to me, "What are you doing about this?" And I said, "What do you want me to do about it?" And the result was, I will just show you the actual result of our conversation. So she mentioned to me that I, as a Muslim women's organization, need to do something about this because a lot of young girls are struggling with this issue. So I'm publishing this book called 30 Rights of Muslim Women, and it will actually show you evidence of what that particular right is of that woman and how she can fight for her own rights. So this is in the works right now. It's not ready, but it should be ready by the year end. And this has global applications. So you can use the information here in the US, or you can use it internationally in places like Afghanistan. So, yeah.
But by the way, I love the cover. It's very colorful, diverse, and I would definitely get this book whenever it will be out.
Well, I want you to spread the book as far as you can, and we're going to have this kind of a discussion with webinars with a very specific right. Each right is going to be taught in very detail. The kind of stuff we're talking about right now, we're doing peripherally, because we don't have enough time. But we will get into very detailed. I just did this in Afghanistan, where women are struggling with mobility because Taliban is coming back, and Taliban wants to take all their rights away, including their right to go out. So I did the right to mobility of, right for you to move around without a guardian. It took 90 minutes, and it was very well received, and it was very in depth. So we plan to do this. So I'm happy to come back if your group is interested.
Definitely, we're more than happy to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to now talk about jihad and what it really means. So, from the translation, jihad literally means the struggle in the path of God, or holy war. However, the media often abuse the meaning of jihad, referring to it as a holy war where Muslims are killing non-believers. And the association of Islam and violence is a common misconception that the general Western public developed about Islam. So my question is, what is jihad in Islam? And why is there so much violence in the name of jihad if they say that Islam is a religion of peace.
Yeah. So there are three types of jihads in, according to the Prophet. So jihad by the tongue, meaning if you really want to fight back, you use your voice to fight back, right? Voice means expression. Voice means you can write something, you can petition something. In the old days, voice would mean you would write something, a letter to somebody, or you would pen an opinion, or you would speak out against it. And the Quran actually encourages that. It encourages that free expression. There are many stories in my book that where the women were complaining to the Prophet, were saying, well, we're not getting the inheritance, or our inheritance is being stolen. And the Prophet was wondering what to do. And a verse came down, the Quranic verse came down as a response to that woman. So the Quranic narrative is that if you have a complaint, you raise the complaint up, whether you raise it up to your spiritual leader, or you raise it up to your community or your society. So protest, all of these things are part of your right. So that's what the first jihad is. So then the jihad of the hand can mean with your bodily, right? Bodily jihad, meaning you can go strive, you can move, you can travel. And this is, by the way, this is how why ISIS people were very clever in the way they told people, hey, you don't belong in the West. Why don't you make your own jihad and, take your body and leave wherever you're going and join us? So that's, jihad of the body means physically exerting, using your body to fight. Then the third one is jihad by the sword meaning fighting or self-defense, or fighting for your right if you have to. And what the extremists do is they take everything out of the context, and they reinterpret everything and they misappropriate it so that they can meet political goals. And but jihad has to be, if you are going to fight a physical fight, it has a lot of rules associated with it. First of all, as I mentioned, it's in self-defense. So aggressive war is very much frowned upon in the Quran. Do not be an aggressor, or do not, if your enemy comes to you and wants to make peace with you, make peace with them. So that kind of war is not permitted. So the other thing, the rules of warfare are very specific. Muslims cannot kill non-combatants, which, by the way, all extremists do. They cannot kill civilians. They cannot destroy property, uproot trees, kill people who are wounded and fleeing. They cannot poison water wells. They cannot commit suicide. Now, this is interesting because this is what the extremists do, right? They do all these suicide bombings. They may not engage in cheating and treachery, commit rape, terrorize populations, torture any people or animals, and they must not wage war against other Muslims. Now, if you are watching news, these are the hallmarks of the terrorist groups. And this is why majority of Muslims will tell you, this is not jihad, this is wrong, this is un-Islamic, what they're doing is completely un-Islamic. They're just fighting, and they're using jihad as a veneer because they need something to justify their action, as a word, as a veneer to show that somehow they are, righteous and legitimate. But we Muslims know that they're not legitimate, that their jihad is not the kind of jihad that, the Prophet taught us. So this is unfortunately what has happened, and this term has gotten misconstrued terribly. Now, also jihad for most Muslims, ordinary Muslims, everyday Muslims, is just internal struggle against yourself to be a better human being. So if you identify some traits that you have, some bad habits that you have, and you're fighting against those, that is also called jihad. It's my personal jihad. It's my personal jihad to lose 5 pounds. This is what every Muslim will tell you. But it's also my personal jihad to be a better human being, to be more kind. So jihad has many multiple meanings. And unfortunately, it's got misconstrued as holy war. And by the way, in Islam, war is never holy. There's no concept of holy war in Islam. War is either justified or not justified. In other words, if somebody fought you, you have the right to fight back. And that is a justified war.
Thank you very much for this clarification. So my next question is, Islam is a really greatly important part of the global society, and no one will deny that. But yet there are still many stereotypes and misconceptions about it in the West that stem from media, prejudice, ignorance, and politics mostly. Islam is often considered as extremist, terrorist, and fundamentalist religion. And my question to you, how can we break these negative stereotypes about Islam and Muslims?
Well, I have been doing this work for many, many years. And since 9/11, I have been involved in this issue of changing perceptions. And I have seen a lot of shift in the younger generation. That is why I'm excited to speak to you. The younger generation, first of all, is asking questions. They're not taking everything, just what is fed to them. Because you fortunately have access to information. So information is the first part, right? You at least see things, you know things, you have a worldview, you are much more universal. And the best way to really tackle these issues is to get to know somebody at a personal level, to get to know a Muslim at a personal level and see their lived life. And I have found that when people have personal relationships with somebody, a group of people, or they know Muslims intimately, or they have befriended a Muslim, that their view changes very quickly. That doesn't mean that they do not, and they can also ask very nuanced questions, which you do not get from, just a Google search. So befriending somebody and then calling out ignorance when somebody is ignorant and they are saying something against a fellow Muslim that you disagree with, call it out. Do the jihad of the tongue, call it out, speak out, say this is not true. And I published a book, which unfortunately is not available, but I wish I could get it to you. It's called Wise Up, Knowledge and Extremism. This has all the frequently asked questions in it, and maybe when it becomes available as an online tool, I can get it to you, because I think that it has all the frequently asked questions that people are seeking to know. And like you said in the very early stages of your discussion, you said that we need more education, right? I did a school presentation for 700 students, and it was literally no more than a 10-minute presentation on Islam, very quick PowerPoints. And the kids at the end, they did a evaluation, and it was not just Islam that was being presented to them. They got a full presentation on the 6 world religions. And they were so excited. They said, oh my God, they saw so many threads between all the religions. Religions are cool. Religions are fun. Religions talk about social justice. Religions talk about the things that matter to people. So oftentimes people see religion as a source of conflict, right? But it's also a source of peace, of reconciliation, So my advice is read as much as you can. Do the kinds of things that you're doing today, get informed, learn more, and get to know a Muslim directly, and that will change a lot.
Thank you very much. I have to be honest with you, and while I was preparing for this conversation, I have a conversation with my sister, who was helping me a lot with the research, and we got to the point where we are considering some questions, whether they will be maybe too heavy and maybe will be seen as people who are criticizing Islam. So that's why I would love to ask you this next question. What is the difference between, this fair criticism of Islam and Islamophobia? And how do you avoid being labeled as Islamophobe?
Yeah, well, so Islamophobia is literally the irrational fear of Islam, right? You fear it, you say everything bad about Islam, But what Muslims would love is if you asked a genuine question, right? If you asked a genuine question, you said, I don't understand this. Can you explain this to me? That's a very, I want to know this. I want to understand this. So that kind of criticism is coming from the right place. All actions are judged by their intention, right? So the intention is, are you trying to shame a Muslim, or are you trying to understand something better? And if you're trying to understand it, and that is a very different place. And most Muslims will be happy to explain things to you. So I had a session where I went to a church and I was speaking there, and there was a guy sitting in front, and he was sitting like this with his arms like this. I could tell that he didn't even want to be there. He was there to provoke me to ask that very tough question, because he wanted to shame me. The whole time, the way he was looking at me as I was presenting my presentation, I could see that he was waiting for that moment where he could get me. And then the slide of Sharia came up, and I described Sharia, and then I described what is wrong with the way Muslims apply Sharia and what is the right way to apply it. And at the end, he came to me and he said, I came here with the intention of wanting to really embarrass you, hit you hard. But the way you explained everything, I don't have fear of Islam anymore. I don't have fear of Sharia anymore. But you got to do this, child marriages. So he basically gave me a project. He said, I want you to focus on child marriage. I want you to do something about that. So although he came with a bad intention, he left as a transformed person. So you may find that if you are questioning, always question it with that intention. I want to learn more. And that is not Islamophobic. That is, that is something that society values in general.
Yeah, thank you. Well, there was also a question coming from one of the persons in the audience, that how did the situation for you, for a Muslim community, changed since Trump left and is no longer a president of the United States?
Well, the Trump presidency was a very traumatic period for Muslims, because he was verbalizing what many people were feeling. And as a very powerful man, the most powerful man on earth, pretty much, he had the bully pulpit to shape public opinion. But what happened out of that was almost a blessing, because many people that were underneath the surface emerged and came out in broad daylight, right? So now we know who they are. Now we know what they think. Now we know what we are up against. So because we know what we're up against, we can now create the right kind of solutions. So Muslims, since 9/11, we Muslims have been working 24/7, literally. I mean, there's a day shift and then there's a night shift. I don't know too many Muslims, other than maybe professionals. Most Muslims are working, have a day job, and then they do volunteer work in their communities. And they do this kind of work that I'm doing with you, trying to explain to their neighbor, their next door, they're going to the school boards, they're trying to do presentations. And now Muslims have, after the presidency, now that we have a Biden administration, we know that we have a very short window, because we have these mid-year elections in America every 2 years. There's elections, and that can change the party system. And so we have about 18 months to educate the public as much as possible on the threat of white supremacy, which is plaguing not just Muslims, but all minorities. So white supremacy in general, it does not against white people. It's very important that we do not alienate the people that are, within the white communities, that do not ascribe to that kind of thinking. But white supremacy is a way of thinking which is not that different than the way ISIS and other extremist groups think and operate. It's very much an in-group versus out-group. This is my group. My group is the only right group, and every other group is therefore a threat to my group. So they consider Jews to be their enemy number one, Muslims two, blacks three, and all immigrants four. So if you take these four groups and you add them up, it's a sizable group of people that they hate or they dislike. So what we are doing now is creating coalitions between all these groups and being very smart in working in coalitions together to strengthen our coalitions along with the white people that do not ascribe to white supremacy. So that is the work that's going on right now in America, and that's why I'm publishing this book on white supremacy. Is my way of bringing the knowledge that I have put together to the public. So this is why we have to be very proactive and very smart in the way we operate.
Absolutely, I agree. I have to ask you another question in regards to minorities. So as most of us know, today most countries of the Islamic world, homosexuality is not socially or legally accepted. So in countries such as Afghanistan, Iran, Mauritania, Nigeria, Somalia, Sudan, Yemen, and Saudi Arabia, homosexuality is explicitly illegal. At the same time, same-sex relations are legal in about 20 Muslim-majority countries, including Albania, Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, Mali, and Kazakhstan. So, for example, homosexual relations between women are legal in Kuwait, but homosexual acts between men are illegal. But in the Quran, we can find several references to the people of Lut, who are the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah, and their destruction by Allah, which is related to their sexual practices. So with a few exceptions, all scholars of Sharia or Islamic law interpret homosexuality as a punishable offense as well as a sin, yet there's no specific punishment. However, some Muslims, such as writer Ishad Manji, who is a lesbian herself, or Dr. Scott Cagle, have stated that Islam does not condemn sexuality. And furthermore, Dr. Cagle and author Ruth Vanita and Muslim scholar Salem Kidwai even claim that ancient Islam has a rich history of homosexuality. So my question is, what is Islam's position on LGBTQI?
So to be honest with you, this is the kind of stuff that requires a legal opinion. So the way Islam is structured, Islam is a democratic religion, meaning we don't have a state, we don't have a state church, right? We don't have a church. We don't have, bishops or councils or a pope or anything like that that ties the entire global Muslim community together, right? We have schools of thought. And anytime you have new opinions, what we call modern dilemmas. By the way, homosexuality is not a modern dilemma. It's an ancient practice. Not only a practice, but people are born as homosexuals. They're born with a certain kind of disposition, and this is why so much of the ancient, whether Muslims were in empires or in societies, homosexuality was recognized as just a way of life for those people. But people had created certain kinds of professions, certain kinds of allowed subcultures to exist. And then so this is why you see some evidence from the past of that kind of what you are seeing in these countries, ancient countries, like where these laws exist. But I come from Kashmir, and many years ago, and we had an entire subculture of marriage brokers, because marriage had to be brokered between two parties, and there had to be a broker somewhere in the middle who goes back and forth between the two parties. And those were mostly people who were mixed gender people. So I don't know exactly which definition they would fall into, but they were part of the LGBTQ community. And they were highly respected and regarded because they were professionals, and nobody ever interfered with their lives. We never knew what they were doing, but they were married, they had their own children, And because marriage was not a state function, the state didn't give you the certificate to marry. Marriage was given to you by a religious leader. So if you had your own religious leader who created that marriage for you, it didn't become a state issue. So in modern societies, we have a very different dilemma because all your rights come from marriage, right? Your Whether you are in corporate America, whether you can go visit a hospital, or whether marriage brings you benefits, medical benefits, health benefits, all these benefits come from when you are married in the eyes of the state. So this is the dilemma of the modern societies, and Muslims have not done real scholarship around this issue, at least modern scholarship. And you are seeing efforts by people like Scott, and because he's a real scholar, and even now I think I'm beginning to see women scholars write on this issue, though they've just started. It hasn't been, it hasn't really reached the public domain. It will create a big stir, obviously, but it needs to be. The real question is, yes, it is considered a sin, but what part of it is the sin, right? It's not a sin to be born as a homosexual. It's not a sin because you are still, in the eyes of God, a vice regent of God, a steward of God, because you're a human being. So from that perspective, you cannot shun a homosexual person. You cannot shun them from your family. You cannot shun them from the community because they are human beings, right? You can shun their lifestyle, but then what do you do because they're born that way with that disposition? What are they supposed to do? And this is where the scholarship needs to come in, right? So I see positive efforts going on, but there's also, the conservative movement that is going to be entrenched in its way of thinking, because they think that somehow if you are going to accept it this way, then you are opening the door for everything else. So I don't have a specific answer that is satisfactory, because it's something that the whole community is in an evolution. It took us by surprise. It happened because a lot of the marriage laws got adopted in the West very quickly, in the US, and then the Muslim world is kind of caught by surprise because people in Muslim countries are demanding the same rights. But the scholarship is not keeping pace with it. And there needs to be fatwas issued, there needs to be opinions written on this, and then there needs to be legislation around this. So this is still work in progress.
Thank you very much for your comment on this. I personally find it very uplifting, as I'm I used to have conversation with a Catholic Church, with the priests about homosexuality, and it was not a good happy end. So it's really interesting to see that some people are seeing Islam as a conservative religion, but now we are hearing this coming from your mouth, and it changes the way people are perceiving Islam and, for example, Catholicism.
Yeah.
So I'm very glad that I asked you this question. I think there are viewers who also waiting for this question, and that was the last question. Unfortunately we have to wrap up. But from our side, I would love to thank you so much for your time, for being here, for giving us your time, for providing us with so much knowledge, and for sharing the understanding, and for everything what you're doing for the Muslim community and also above. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. And like I said, so the book I'm publishing, and this is going to be exciting news, the book I'm publishing, The 30 Rights, I would love for you to get involved in that in whatever way you can. But then there is something called Western Islamic dilemmas, like we just talked about, the dilemma of LGBTQ communities, and how do Western Muslims navigate this? Everything from pornography, premarital sex, to all these things that Western Muslims are plagued with, but they don't have. So we will be also publishing doing some research on this issue. Next year, an entire book on Western Islamic dilemmas. And so we should then have a more robust discussion around this. I mean, in conclusion, I think that people don't realize, but because Islam is a fairly democratic religion, if you have a great scholar and a great philosopher who comes out with an idea whose time is here, it shifts the entire community, because people latch onto that idea and they go, oh my God, an idea finally emerged, and everybody embraces it. So I'm hoping that with my 30 Rights of Muslim Women book, the idea of how to treat women is going to emerge, because it is so evident that the Prophet treated women with so much respect, and God treats women with such respect, and why should man deny that? And you know, I'm trying to do my part, and you do your part in bringing your community to listen and hear and then convey to others. So I thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, Morgan, and thank you for everybody else, the audience out there that I couldn't see.